So the protagonist of today's talk is Augustin Barrios, one of the great guitarist composer. The idea of inviting Eoin to talk about Barrios came after listening to a few videos that Eoin recently recorded for the Guitar Salon International. I'm really happy that Eoin accepted and decided to talk about one aspect that is not so well known of Barrios, that is his method of teaching.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here talking about Augustin Barrios. And I'd like to thank Marco for putting these lectures on and for asking me to be part of them. I'm very grateful for that. And although I'm no expert on Barrios, I do hope that this talk might shed some light on him as an innovator for the guitar. The talk will focus not on Barrios as a composer primarily, but as a teacher and a guitarist. The main document I will be looking at here is the Barrios Method, recently published. I'll go into the details of that a bit later. Firstly, just to go through some of his early life. It's relevant because in looking at his formation as a guitarist, it sheds quite a lot of light on what he then prioritized as a teacher later on. Barrios obviously was born in Paraguay. His parents were Argentinian and they were educated and cultured people. His father was in fact Argentinian vice consul and had probably one of the most comprehensive libraries in the Misiones region. This information I've taken, by the way, from the excellent biography of Barrios by Richard Stover, 6 Silver Moonbeams. His parents placed a high value on culture. So Barrios we might get the impression sometimes that Barrios was born in the jungle. It's not quite true. He had a cultured upbringing. When he went to school, he attained excellent academic grades. As a guitarist, though, the most important influence was Gustavo Sosa Escalada, an Argentinian-born Paraguayan who worked locally as a purchaser of livestock, but had studied guitar formally in Buenos Aires. Barrios' father, Doroteo, in fact, played the guitar casually and strummed chords and such, and his instrument was actually probably fitted with metal strings. Very interesting, as Barrios himself is famous for playing with metal strings. But with Sosa Escalada, Barrios studied all the school of Aguado, the complete method of saw, all the compositions of Arcas and Garcia Tolsa. The choice of these particular methods is probably down purely to the limited sheet music available in South America at that time, certainly in Paraguay. Sosa Escalada had likely purchased his sheet music in Buenos Aires, where you could get music by Coste, Parga, Damas, Viñas, Jimenez Manjon, Gaspar Segreras, in addition to the ones I've already mentioned. There was no Tarraga in South America at this time. Barrios revered Tarraga, but was not formed in the music of Tarraga early on. Tarraga came to South America with Domingo Prat when he arrived in Buenos Aires in 1908. Tarraga, I should be clear, did not himself go to South America, but Domingo Prat, the Spanish guitarist, brought sheet music with him. So this formation had an enormous influence on Barrios' teaching, it seems. We can deduce this from the method and from the etudes which Barrios focused on. The method, I'll go into the detail of the method later, of course, consists largely of etudes by Sor and Aguado. These etudes Barrios no doubt studied as a young man. He was also a devotee of cost, and there are many cost etudes which Barrios refingered in his own way, and these are also now available. They've been published in the same collection as the method. As for the rest of his biography, obviously we haven't got time to go into that. Barrios then, he was living in Asunción in Paraguay, where he studied a lot with Sosa Escalada and went to school. There was in fact a good musical scene. He was influenced much by Nicolino Pellegrini, an Italian violinist who'd settled there. And he took various jobs, none of them were successful. His passion was clearly for the guitar, which he practiced up to 10 to 12 hours per day. Yes, 10 to 12 hours per day. There was later he moved to, this was in around 1910, he moved to Buenos Aires, and there was a thriving guitar scene. Domingo Prat had settled there, and along with Antonio Jiménez Manjon, and also the famous Argentinian Julio Sagreras, whose father, Gaspar, has already been mentioned. It was here also that Barrios first heard Miguel Llobet in concert, and Barrios later declared Llobet to be the greatest guitarist he'd ever heard. So of this, we know that Barrios was born into a fairly middle-class and cultured family, and his formation as a guitarist was in Sor and Aguado, those classic studies. It was really what was available at the time. Obviously his artistry developed greatly in the coming years, moving to Uruguay and arriving in Brazil in 1916, just before his great flourishing as an artist and as a composer. But now I'd like to jump to the last 4 to 5 years of his life. When Barrios arrived in Mexico City in December 1939, he was already weak from illness. There he suffered a major heart attack and was actually probably recovering from a minor one, which he'd suffered a few months before. And so it must have come as something of a relief to Barrios when the El Salvadorian president, General Martinez, an admirer of Barrios, appointed him professor of guitar at the Rafael Olmedo School of Music and Speech in El Salvador. He was presented with a check, 5,000 colons, I'm not sure what that would be today, and a request that he reside there in El Salvador. And it was there that he was to remain for the final 4 years of his life. In fact, he died there. He continued to concertize at this point, but most of his time was devoted to teaching, and he built up a circle of students who were devoted to him. One of them, Candido Morales, had this to say about Barrios' teaching in 1974. Quotes now. Barrios never approved a lesson played by a student that was not played impeccably. He encouraged the student to play with enthusiasm, with sweetness and necessary clarity. He maintained that the guitar should be played so that it is heard, for which he recommended not only the study of scales, but also the use of the barre, slavine, rest strokes, trills, portamento, mordent, etc. When a student played a lesson, he would often improvise variations at the same time, producing beautiful melodies. This last comment, I should say end quote, this last comment about improvising variations whilst the student played may well have been the source of so many of Barrios' second guitar parts and added variations, which he added to etudes. We know from the documents of his curriculum, which have survived, that he often had students play together using these added parts, sometimes 3 or 4 as well. there's an etude by Aguado, which Barrios actually turned into a quartet. As for the curriculum itself, that brings us now to the Barrios Method, recently published by Les Productions d'O, I'm sorry my French is not very good, as part of the biggest collection of published works by Barrios to date. It's been edited by the well-known American luthier, and I'm sure he would like me to say Mangorian, Federico Shepherd. The publication of this is a result of years of labour by those involved, particularly Ramses Calderon, who spent years speaking to former students, collecting as much as he could. And he writes this in the introduction of the method, which I've got here. The present book is the approach to guitar technique used by Augustin Barrios in his studies program during the 4 years that he taught in El Salvador, 1940 to 1944, at the Escuela Nacional de Música Rafael Olmedo. The techniques have been described and commented on to demonstrate as closely as possible how Barrios taught them, and he goes on to list some of the things there, which I'll just miss out for now. It should be noted that the materials here display the fingerings as written and taught by Barrios. I'm going to look at the fingerings in some detail in a moment. That the method was and is designed to be used by a teacher and student working together, rather than a course of self-study. In the years before his death, Barrios created the studies program, adopting as a teaching style the guitar method of Juan Parras del Moral, but modifying it to reflect his individual playing style, complementing it with studies and pieces he composed and arrangements of other composers for 2, 3 and 4 guitars. You've heard me mention the Juan Parras del Moral. He was one of the main guitar teachers in Barcelona, Spain, in the early part of the 20th century. He put together a method of studies, a course of studies, mainly by Sor and Aguado, a few others. It's in 3 books. The first quite easy, the second sort of intermediate standard, and then more advanced. Barrios took these studies and refingered, at least the difficult ones he refingered. The first thing Barrios likely taught, however, was the importance of practice. We can see from the testimony of Cándido Morales, already quoted, that he was a demanding teacher. We know he treated himself no differently. I mentioned earlier that he was known to practice between 10 and 12 hours per day. In these last years, he continued to maintain a demanding schedule, practicing from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. every day. And an hour of his practice, according to Barrios himself, was devoted to scales in all keys, single stop, double stop, with various right-hand combinations, as well as other technical exercises. Barrios, by the way, from his youth was a big fan of physical exercise in general, and he maintained this habit throughout his life. There's a wonderful story related by his students, Cándido Morales and also Roberto Bracamonte, that Barrios, when playing a piece, once he'd got it to a certain standard, he would put or tie one bag of 100 marbles to one end of the music stand. He would then play the piece through, and if there were no mistakes, he would take one marble from the bag and place it in an empty bag at the other end of the music stand. He would repeat this process over and over again 100 times. But if he got, say, to the 79th run of the piece and he made a mistake, having played it perfectly 78 times before, he would put all the marbles back into the first bag and start the process again. Almost unbelievable. Barrios said himself, and I quote, "Guitar students have to study the pieces for 8 hours daily. Do not play in public if you haven't practiced enough. So he was no fan of shortcuts. Practice was, for Barrios, of the utmost importance. As to the content of his teaching, he used a highly organised curriculum. We know this from the notes of one of his students, Cecilio Orellana, and I'm now going to read through some of that curriculum, a 4-year curriculum, similar perhaps to a bachelor's degree now. In the first year, students had to study a theoretical section, historical guitar notes, description of the guitar, method of tuning, posture, and this next point is very interesting, the full musical possibilities of the instrument and special effects, and slurred notes. In the practical section was the method of Juan Parras del Moral, technique of the major and minor scales in all keys with the corresponding chords, 2-note scales, double stops. These were in 3rds, 6ths, octaves, chromatic, and in tenths. In the second year, more slur technique of bi-chord scales, I think double stops again, 3rds, 6ths, 8ths, 10ths, and all the extension of the fingerboard. 25 progressive studies from the method of Juan Parras del Moral, and then for advanced students, arrangements of pieces for 4 guitars, and also studies by Tarrega, by Barrios himself, and other composers. In the 3rd year, slightly more advanced, again studies by composers, Barrios as mentioned, lots of guitar duo material, arrangements of works by Torroba, Granados, Scarlatti, Mozart, Coste, and Barrios himself. And in the 4th year, studies by Coste and Aguado, fingered by Mangore. You may have taken from that a great emphasis on scales. This indeed reminds me of another great 20th century virtuoso, Jascha Heifetz, the famous violinist. Heifetz is a great story about Heifetz being stopped in Manhattan by someone who did not recognise him, asked him the way to Carnegie Hall. Heifetz responded with one word, practice. And there's a quote of Barrios in the method, practice makes the maestro. But on scales, Heifetz, perhaps more relevant to this, I've gone off topic a bit. Heifetz was devoted to scales, as for example, Isaac Perlman has stated. Barrios was, by all accounts, constantly in search for new sounds. You will have noted from the first year of the curriculum one of the points in the theoretical section, which I highlighted when I read it, the full musical possibilities of the instrument and its special effects. Barrios himself hints at this in an article for the Guatemalan newspaper El Liberal Progresista in 1933, in which he recounts his first meeting with his teacher, Gustavo Sosa Escalada. I quote from Barrios, "One day there arrived in the village of San Juan Bautista, where I was, Gustavo Sosa Escalada. He was a schooled guitarist. I listened to him play, and great was my surprise in discovering the pampa instrument that I had played with so much joy contained such marvellous possibilities." Various critics of his day refer to his exploration of sounds in their reviews of his concerts. From the Guatemalan newspaper Nuestro Diario, I quote, "Little by little the audience warms up. The guitar becomes a piano, violin, flute, mandolin, drum. There is nothing that this man can't do on a guitar. At times it seems the guitar plays itself." End quote. Another critic from El Liberal Progresista wrote, "The guitar, that instrument of such poor resources, a rebel like this Indian, seems to have become docile in the agile, caressing hands of this man of the Pampas. Strange sonorities, unexpected shadings, delicate pizzicatos, barely audible, all communicate a sensation of perfect mastery of the guitar. Barrios, of course, used metal strings, and Herrera Klinger stated of a 1912 concert in Montevideo, quote, "The novelty was the metal strings, from which he drew forth rare effects with sonorities that were unknown to us, due to his way of smoothing the harshness of the metal," end quote. Now, I'm not sure if his way of smoothing the harshness of the metal is a reference to Barrios' tonal control, or the particular method he had of putting rubber through the ends of the strings at the bridge to reduce the twanginess which the metal produced. In any case, what are these strange sonorities and rare effects? Well, firstly, in the Barrios Method, this new publication, Barrios' various right-hand strokes are described in quite a lot of detail, and it is astonishing to what extent Barrios varied the way he approached the string with his right-hand fingers. And this has nothing to do with ponticello or tasto, but the approach of the finger to the string. And I will share some descriptions from the method. I'll not go into great detail because I haven't quite got to grips with these myself. In the method, however, they are illustrated very well. There are pictures. So the first stroke taught by Barrios was this. Holding the hand in what he called the orthodox position with a bend in the wrist, Barrios plucked the strings exclusively with the fingertips, moving the last two joints slightly upwards towards the fretboard. In this direction, like this. Not this way, as most of us do now, but this way. Barrios did use nails, very short nails, filed filed the shape of the fingertip, but he had strokes which used the nails and strokes which didn't. This one was only with fingertips. The second stroke was much more similar to what we're used to today, this way. So less of a bend in the wrist and playing towards the bridge. For this he used nail, a slight, small amount of nail. He also had a stroke where he placed the finger quite deep in between the strings, plucked up, and this was for sweet and clear sounds. I haven't quite got to grips with this myself, so I'm not going to try it. For fast passages, he maintained this orthodox position, as he called it, and he played the string this way, straight up. Another stroke he used was delicately plucking the string towards the fingerboard, like this, for soft and delicate passages. If you think of the Scriabin, such a stroke is perfect for a passage like that. So it's quite interesting just how many sounds Barrios would have been able to achieve just by changing the angle of his right hand, the depth of contact with the fingertip on the string, the direction of stroke. Many, many possibilities. I've only mentioned 5. There are more in the method, which I'll leave just now. This would perhaps cover Barrios's conception of melodic colour that would change during a melodic phrase, or the general character of the piece perhaps. But Barrios was clearly fascinated with what I might call textural or harmonic colour. And this is evident from his refingering of the more advanced etudes in the method. He loved putting the melody onto an inner string. For example, in his version of Sohr's famous B minor etude, opus 35, number 22, he has the melody almost entirely on the third string. So Sohr's original fingering for this is like this. Barrios changes it to this. This may seem slightly peculiar, because to my ear at least, the second string is the most singing and suitable for melody on the classical or Spanish guitar. It has plenty of sustain, but is never bright like the first string. However, on metal strings, this would likely be quite different. And I also think Barrios had such a love of this textural and harmonic colour that I mentioned a moment ago, that putting the melody on the third string helped him in his constant search for these beautiful sounds. Now have a listen to the A section of Sohr's etude in G major, number 5 from opus 31. This is Sohr's fingering. Barrios fingers it like this. Note here Barrios' love for the campanella effect, where the notes are fingered in a way in which the pitch does not correspond to the strings going from low to high. So the lowest note is on the third string, the next note is on the fourth string, and then the melody on the second. And we think about the opening of the Andante Religioso from La Catedral. Here the melody is on the third string, the bass is on the highest string, and the tenor voice on the lowest string. And it produces this effect. So campanella fingerings are used pretty much throughout that passage, and it sounds very different to playing it like this, or even here. Now Tue often used fingering such as these, but Barrios makes much more regular use of them, resulting in quite exquisite tonal colour. Another feature of the refingering of the Sohr etude, which I played a moment ago, the one in G major, and connected to campanella, is Barrios' tendency to change string in the middle of a melodic phrase, a striking departure from the general approach of the time, which was to try and keep the melody on the same string, as Segovia, for example, did so well. And whilst this playing across the strings for a melody is now very common, I think these days it's perhaps often done for the sake of ease, whereas Barrios does it in order to try and achieve a great variety of tonal colour. And Barrios loved the use of campanella for arpeggios. Just think of the prelude of La Cathédrale. Or this passage in the Valse Opus 8 number 4. And so on. And this is treated in the method as well. Note, for example, his version of another sort etude from Opus 31, this time number 7. Now, Sohr's fingering is like this. Barrios changes it to this. So he was in constant search of such colours, colours across strings, harmonic or textural colour. The method covers a great many other aspects of guitar sound, such as the snare drum effect, tambora, various ways of various approaches to vibrato, both horizontal and vertical, and also various ways of performing trills, including cross string. This is long before John Williams and David Russell. So, finally, on the point about tonal colour, Barrios went well beyond the simplistic ponticello and sol tasto variations so commonly, and I think often lazily, employed today. Not that you shouldn't use the variety of tone along the string, but there are many more options. So what I've been describing here as textural or harmonic colour strikes me as central to his whole approach to the guitar, and I believe is one of the things which sets him apart as a composer for it. The spacing of notes within chords is complementary to harmonic language, what produces the unique sounds of composers. For example, a Chopin sound or a Schumann sound, quite different. Of course, the harmony is slightly different, but the way they space chords is different as well. A singing quality is produced when chords are spaced well. And just recently, I was studying a beautiful song, trying to brush up my very limited piano skills, Richard Strauss's Morgen, and it became clear. I was going to demonstrate it here, but I couldn't really set things up in a way which would allow me to do that. That simply doubling a note completely changes the effect of the chord. It turns it into something fine but slightly dull to something vibrant in singing. Barrios, to my mind at least, is pretty much in a class of his own when it comes to doing this on the guitar. His sensitivity to colour was indeed so great that he knew exactly how to distribute notes in chords in order to make them sing, such as in the introduction to the Mazurka Appassionata. This is one of the things which make which I find makes Barrios guitaristically satisfying to play. It's connected also to his wide choice of keys. G minor, for example, is used for dark passages, as in the Choro de Saudade. And I won't play this because it involves quite a bit of retuning, but he very frequently employs flat keys. Sohr had a habit of doing this as well. Barrios may well have been influenced by him to some extent. And the choice of key often reflects or helps capture the mood of the piece. If you were to play the opening of the Choro in E minor, for example, even though it would be lower, it doesn't have quite as dark a mood and character. In conclusion, I think Barrios is remarkable. He was both a composer and performer of the highest standard, one of the finest ever produced by the guitar, I think. It is wonderful that with the publication of the Barrios Method, we are now able to, metaphorically at least, sit at his feet and learn as his students. And of everything I've mentioned in this talk, I would like to emphasize his love for the sound of the guitar. And it's quite something to try and enter into just how he conceived the sound of the guitar. I hope you will excuse the cliche, but I think he conceived of it much more orchestrally than pianistically. And so I'd like to finish with a quote of Barrios with regard to sound. It's something that I think I need to remember as well. And it is this: put love to every sound that you produce when you play the guitar. Each sound has to be given with love.
Thank you so much, Ian.
Thanks, Ian. Are you ready to go?
I think so.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Congratulations on your lecture. That was fantastic. I suppose loads of people will have questions, and if they do, they can put them up in the chat screen. So myself or Marco can unmute them. But I suppose just first, the obvious question that comes from your lecture is, obviously Barrios was so forward thinking and so ahead of his time. Do you have any ideas on why maybe it takes now that a lot of these things are being, there was sort of a gap between where he was at 1944 and then in terms of how he influenced people at the time? Do you think maybe he could have influenced proceedings more, or why didn't this happen?
Well, as most people will know, I think for various reasons, Barrios's music wasn't really played, didn't become part of the standard repertoire at his death, and it was really with John Williams in the 1970s that people got to know Barrios. So I think that's one reason that Barrios had there's a slight delay in his more innovative approach to the guitar becoming more commonplace, especially with the playing across strings. There are some other reasons which, and I'm no expert in this, but the people who have put these books together have been at this for years and years, and they've encountered quite a lot of opposition along the way at various official levels, and obstacles seem to have been placed in their way. I don't really know the details. I've heard stories, but I'm certainly not qualified to comment on them. But I think also for that reason, it just took a long time to get these materials out. Of course, Richard Stover, who wrote the biography, he also, years ago, produced a sort of 4-volume collection of works by Barrios, and that was a sort of go-to. It's been a go-to text, really, along with his biography. So people have been doing it, but it seems to be that now Barrios is, this side of Barrios will become more well known and appreciated.
Great, thanks. Does anybody else have any questions at this stage?
I think Michael O'Toole.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Do I go on? Oh yeah, I'm.
You're there. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Eoin. How are you?
Hello.
Nice to meet you. Well done. That was great. I was just wondering about the use of metal strings. I always thought when I was researching different things that the metal strings was like a practical thing. It was hard to get, and the heat and everything. They were just hard to come by in South America, and that was my assumption maybe. But when you were talking, you seemed to say also that he kind of got a lot out of the metal strings, and do you also did he also encourage his students to use metal strings when he was teaching in El Salvador, or did he kind of do you have any ideas on that, or any thoughts on that?
Well, on the last point, I don't actually know. It's a good question. I haven't really heard of anyone else doing it, so I'm not sure he did encourage it. There are various theories as to why he used them. The first thing is that his father, I think I mentioned briefly that his father played a bit of guitar, and he had a guitar with metal strings. It was quite common for people who just kind of strummed the guitar to use metal strings. So of course he was brought up with that, and but I've heard it said that gut strings, or at least good quality ones, were not easy to come by in South America. But of course, there were plenty of people using them. Domingo Prat himself settled there in 1908. There was quite a tradition of guitar in South America before him, with certainly the Sagreras family. And I haven't really heard of anyone else using metal strings. One theory is that he used to sweat a lot in concert, much more so than in practice, and so he got through gut strings very quickly. So metal perhaps were practical. I think he probably liked the sound. I think when you look at his fingerings and his love of Campanella, the sound across the strings, and when you listen to his recordings, for example, the opening of the Andante Religioso in La Catedral, he achieves a remarkable sustain in the sound with metal strings. So I think he liked them, but it did work against him in the more sort of guitar circle societies, and no one really approved of it. Although it sounds very narrow-minded today. I mean, either it sounded good or it didn't. But that's what he was up against. So.
Yeah, I guess it was used as a stick to beat him with really by
Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, Barrios was very unique and independent-minded, and sort of went at it alone in some ways. He did have patrons, and he relied on patrons for much of his life, and they were very good friends to him. There's many more details about that in Stover's biography. So he was not alone, but he's sort of outside the sort of normal guitar scene.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, we have a question from Kian.
Hi, Eoin. Thanks so much for your talk. I found it really, really interesting. I was just wondering, I've come across some of the early phonograph recordings of Barrios playing himself, and I was wondering if you have listened to these and what you thought of them, and can you hear any his technique in these recordings?
Yes, I think you can hear his technique. Obviously, the recordings are pretty poor quality, and people have tried to clean them up a bit, but they're still fairly grainy to listen to. So we don't really get an appreciation of his sound. I mean, he could certainly. We can hear that in the recordings. He could play very fast. He could play very cleanly. the metal strings do come across, albeit in a slightly dull way. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the sustain that he could achieve with metal strings, it does come across in the recordings as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think his early recordings, it's somewhat perhaps limited in terms of trying to find out how best to play the piece. I mean, we don't know whether he was comfortable recording. He certainly was very early in recording, much earlier than Segovia. To play quite fast in order to fit it into the sort of disk space available at that time, and I've heard anecdotally playing in his room the Valse Opus 8 No. 4, and it was really quite slow, and maybe suggesting that that's how he preferred it. Maybe he was just practicing slowly. So we don't know. They're certainly worth listening to. Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Thank you so much.
I have a question. It's just a curiosity about some of the last thing you said, mentioning how we consider the guitar sound more as an orchestra than yeah, in an orchestral way instead rather than pianistic way. So if you could say something more about this.
Yeah, I think there's perhaps a wider point to be made. I mean, this is obviously a big discussion in the guitar, and I would refer you to an article written a few years ago by Marcelo Caiath, the Brazilian guitarist, and he goes into this in some details, tracing the development of the guitar, of guitar playing from a much more orchestral approach to a much more pianistic approach, starting perhaps in the 1970s. And the guitar making, the priorities perhaps of guitar makers, I think, reflect this change. But Barrios, one of the reviews of his concerts describes him sounding like a piano and a flute and a violin. And in the method, he goes into some detail about special effects. I mentioned the snare drum effect. He was even from an early age. He was taken with the possibilities of the guitar, the actual oral possibilities. So he did conceive it as something perhaps much greater than a mere guitar. And I'm sure that's why I thought that it was such a wonderful instrument. I think the fingerings that I went into also suggest this. Seeking after interesting sounds, sounds that are not necessarily, not necessarily the cleanest sounds, but sounds with a bit of complexity. Those Campanella fingerings, when you play a chord like that, it suddenly, it's not just one instrument playing the chord, but maybe a few. You can hear the woodwind and the strings playing together suddenly. So, I mean, it's just my, I just threw that sort of cliche in at the end because I think it does encapsulate his whole approach. But yeah, that's
okay. Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, thank you.
Can I ask you maybe, Ian, as a teacher, what you got from this research on his method?
Well, the fact he was quite demanding and quite thorough was the first thing that came across. In the method, very interestingly, he has they have scans of his scales with his fingerings in his hand. And the fingerings are very interesting. They're not the easiest fingerings for double stop scales. He doesn't like sort of sliding up the string. He likes changing finger a lot. And of course, he's trying to develop in his students and in himself, quick fingers across strings. Of course, that ties in with his approach to playing across strings rather than on the same string quite a lot. And so that approach to scales I've certainly sort of taken on from Barrios. I think for me, although I've always practiced scales, in reading about his great commitment to scales, I've sort of rediscovered them myself, and the benefits of them have or rather, a greater number of benefits have become apparent to me with scales. The other thing about him as a teacher, though, is this starting with a love of the sound, of musical possibilities. It's very easy as a teacher just to get bogged down in technicality. So if you put your finger there that way, or if you hold your hand that way, things will get better. And of course they do. But quite often with students, even amateurs quite near the beginning, just give them the musical concept, get them to play perhaps if there's 2 lines in the piece, get them to play the lines individually, and suddenly they can do it much more quickly. So I think starting from the musical idea, starting from a conception of sound, rather than merely put your finger here, would be the other thing I've taken from studying his teaching.
Thanks.
And is there anything else from studying the method, in particular when you're performing these pieces or getting them ready for concert, that you've adapted that you wouldn't have been familiar with before? Like, do you practice the marble thing?
Well, the marble thing I find it hard to believe. It's so extreme. But then he did used to practice 10 to 12 hours a day. So
maybe that's why.
Yeah. But it's that approach in a much less extreme form is quite common, and I use it myself and use it on others, which is to play a phrase 7 times correctly in a row, and if you get to the 6th time, go back to the start and do it all over again. But I was aware of that and doing that anyway. I don't think I've quite had enough time to fully digest everything. These books are fairly recent, and although I've known Federico Shepherd for a long time, and indeed it was his guitar I was using for the demonstrations, because it's a copy of Simplicio, possibly owned by Barrios. I haven't really quite had enough time to change the ways ways I play his pieces. But I think his approach to fingering would certainly would certainly be something I would take very seriously now in playing his pieces. I would be looking for those campanella effects, playing across strings, putting melodies on quite high up the fingerboard on lower strings. So where there are no fingerings by Barrios to go on, of course that's often the case because he had a terrible habit of not writing his compositions down. but where there are fingerings, it's very clear he liked that. So yeah.
Great.
Also in his transcription, they are quite. For example, the transcription of Bach is always changing string in the middle of the melody, and it's quite nice. This research of variety.
Absolutely, yeah. I've got his transcript. The one of the volumes is actually of his transcriptions, and also transcriptions by one of his patrons. Not all transcriptions by him, but the fingerings are all by him. And yes, it's very clear that in the transcriptions he was always looking for these sounds. Deliberately transcribing them in ways which would allow him to put melodies high up or have the notes in sort of the wrong order across strings. So and the thing that I find in playing his transcriptions, like his pieces, they all just sound good. They're hard to play, but they sound good. The guitar just sings throughout. And I always think with Schumann, with Schumann's piano music, if you just sort of press the pause button at one point and then look at the score, the chord is beautifully spaced. You could take it out of context of the piece, and it's just beautiful. It sounds perfectly balanced. And Barrios is like that. You can stop the piece at any point, look at the chord, and it just sounds gorgeous. It's he was a master of the instrument, and it's incredible in his compositions that he was able to merge so perfectly a great creative mind. I mean, he conceived these pieces with very interesting harmonic modulations often, but he conceived them immediately in a way which worked on the guitar. The two are in perfect harmony. almost more than any other composer, much more than say with Saw, for example, I would say.
We have another question from Michael. You want to make it? Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Ian, do you think he gets painted in an inaccurate light a lot? I think I remember coming across things in the 70s where he was being dismissed completely in various histories of music, and then to the 90s and 2000s where he was being called the greatest composer ever, and there's so much in between. But do you think, like, my perception of him would have been to feel sorry for him? He seems like a wayward character. I think do you think these type of things are good because it helps us think of him as an actual guitarist, an actual person with ideas, rather than just someone to kind of feel sorry for, and to feel like, you know, everybody gets involved with the Segovia story and the tragedy and the kind of all that of it, but it's nice to kind of do you think it's about time we kind of looked at him as a kind of proper, you know, person with proper ideas about the guitar?
Yeah, and I think perhaps looking at him from the angle of a guitar, to look at him, you know, and that I think it does help with what you say about thinking of him as a sort of normal human being. He's a very complicated, and the biography of Stover is well worth reading. You get a very balanced, idea of him from that. I mean, obviously, he went through his whole Mangori stage with dressing up in feathers and things, and you know, very completely unique. Yeah, I think I'm always very surprised when I read that his compositions were dismissed. It may have something to do with his early compositions, even by his friends. They often said they weren't very good. He hit about the age of 32, and he completely changed. He didn't completely change, but everything came together. So in 1917, 1918, he composed a huge amount of pieces, many of his famous pieces, Sueño and La Floresta, for example, beautiful pieces with all of the qualities that we associate with Barrios. But before that, I think it was much more of a mixed bag. And even in his concerts, he was revered as a great interpreter, a great guitarist. I mean, what he could do with the instrument, the sounds he could produce. But his programs were often quite bad. I mean, you know, quite lightweight. And he changed that completely as well in 1916. So yeah, just about his arrival in Brazil, 1916, you see the change. So yeah.
We have a comment from Luis.
Okay. Oh, hi. Hi, Ian. Thank you very much for excellent insights about Barrios Method. I was just curious, when you're talking now, when you're talking before about metal strings, I just wanted to make a comment that there has been lots of research in Brazil, scholarly research about Barrios in Brazil, and people are finding out many interesting things. And there were even reviews of Barrios concerts that we have access today, which I'm sure you are aware. And I just browsing here very fast, I found out about metal strings. And Mário de Andrade, who was a very important writer in Brazil in 1929, criticized Barrios for using metal strings because he said that metal strings were for folk musicians playing in the streets because they needed the guitar to sound louder. And he says that guitarists who play indoors should not use metal strings, they should use gut strings. I thought it was really interesting, this view as well.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, I mean, I just think, either it sounded good or it didn't, and that's the end of the story, really. He must have had fingers like leather. I mean, to do what he did on metals. But
the sound he makes with metal strings is incredible. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, totally unique. But he could play on gut strings as well. I've read somewhere that when the famous meeting with Segovia, where he went to Segovia's room and he played through his pieces, and Segovia apparently very much liked La Catedral, etc. You probably know the rest of the story and various accounts of the story. But apparently he played Segovia's guitar. He just on that occasion, so he was perfectly comfortable with gut strings, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yes. Last year I played his Simplicio. And we are looking with a friend guitar maker and a restorer, and what he was saying that Simplicio, looking at Simplicio, seems that it was a guitar used with gut string. But we have to say that the Simplicio was not. Simplicio was a guitar that one of his friend gave to him, and it was very rich. And the Simplicio was the guitar, the most expensive guitar, and he was not using it for everyday concert. Okay. So looking at that guitar, the idea that we had that he was keeping the best guitar with the gut string, but I'm not sure. It's just what was my experience.
Yeah, well, that is quite interesting, and perhaps gives a certain amount of weight to the notion that he used because he sweated so much, and so perhaps in a guitar that he wasn't using in concert so much, he was actually maintaining gut strings. I would think though that if he using metal in concerts would mean he would have to do a fair amount of practice on metal, to get to grips with it. He got through a huge amount of guitars, and you need to ask an expert. But he had a huge number of guitars throughout his career, and I did sometimes wonder if he used to just play them out very quickly with the metal strings. I mean, I couldn't imagine putting metal strings on. I'd be terrified.
Okay, do you have more questions? Okay, so maybe I can ask. Okay, thanks again, Ian.
Pleasure.
It was lovely to.
No, thank you very much for asking me. Thank you.
And maybe I can leave just 1 or 2 minutes to Luis to introduce his next lecture. Is okay, Luis?
Oh, yeah, sure. Thanks, and Marco, and next week I'll talk about Ferdinand Reber, who was an Austrian composer. He was born in 1880, died in 1953, and until the early 2000s, really nobody had heard of him. And today, many people, like Lorenzo Micheli, for example, was one of the pioneers in recording and performing Reber. And I did my PhD on Reber, finished last year, and discovered many new things that were not known before, and also worked with his music very closely, so got to know a little bit about style issues and things like that. And next week I'll give you an introduction to the world of Reber, talk a little bit about Reber, and talk a little bit about his guitarists as well. Some famous names like Luis Evalka, but also some not very known names like, for example, Gerta Hammerschmidt, who was his niece and also a guitarist and his main advocate. And I hope to see you all there. All here, I mean, all here in your homes, yeah.
Okay, so thanks so much, and see you next week.
Yep.